The deepest fatigue you feel is rarely physical. It is the invisible tax levied by the things you actively refuse to see. It is the cost of the mental labor spent in maintenance of an absence. If you made the conscious choice this morning to ignore a specific person, a persistent problem, or a crippling anxiety, you did not achieve freedom. You signed a cognitive lease agreement, agreeing to pay rent in the currency of attentional energy every single hour of the day. This attempt to wall off internal pain, far from being a masterful act of psychological defense, is often the single most powerful drain on your available life force. We mistake the cessation of outward reaction for genuine indifference, believing that if the lips do not move and the fingers do not type, the battle has been won. But the true battlefield is silent, residing in the subtle, persistent hum of unresolved psychic tension. Seneca defined this tension when he observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. When you choose to ignore, rather than to structurally resolve, you are merely moving the reality into the imagination, where it gains exponential power through rumination and projection. This quiet tracking, the constant internal calculation of the ignored party's current status, their potential move, or their reaction to your silence, becomes a form of digital addiction without the screen. It's a hidden tab open in the browser of your mind, relentlessly consuming RAM, slowing down every valuable process in your life. If you feel this weight, that subtle exhaustion that coffee cannot cure, understand that you are not tired from work. You are drained by active absence. The ghosting fallacy, how no contact becomes proof of investment, and the anatomy of true indifference. We must immediately dissect the ghosting fallacy, perhaps the most damaging psychological maneuver of the modern, emotionally fragile landscape. Ghosting, or the strategic use of no contact designed to solicit a reaction, is widely heralded as a power move, a sign of emotional maturity, or a protective boundary. In reality, in 90% of cases, it is undeniable proof of intense, unresolved emotional investment. The strategy is predicated entirely on the expectation of the other party's suffering, recognition, or eventual submission. Consider the immense energy required to maintain the wall of silence. The ghoster is constantly checking for the text they will not answer, the social media profile they will not block, the phone call they will not return. This disciplined withholding is not discipline. It is reactive hostility channeled into a performance. If you are tracking the days you have successfully ignored someone, you are not indifferent. You are an accountant of resentment. This is the difference between genuine architectural irrelevance and temporary emotional absence. True indifference, the state revered by the Stoics, requires no effort whatsoever, because the object or person in question has ceased to possess relevance to your purpose, your mission, or your internal peace. Marcus Aurelius reminds us, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. The ghosting fallacy operates by clinging desperately to the estimate, the judgment that the person is worthy of such elaborate, punitive silence. If you truly revoked the estimate, if the person became no more significant than a loose stone on the road, you would not need a strategy. You would simply drive on. The frantic energy dedicated to the performance of apathy is the giveaway. It demonstrates that the subject still commands a premium price on your emotional market. Many who employ no contact as a means of personal recovery raise the valid objection: I must cut off contact for my own well-being and safety. This is functionally necessary and often crucial. But we must differentiate between functional necessity and psychological necessity. You can physically block a number and never think of it again. That is healthy boundary setting. But if you block the number and then spend 3 hours a day checking their secondary profiles or writing internal monologues about why they deserved the block, You have not set a boundary. You have merely relocated the source of the emotional injury deeper inside your internal citadel. The siege continues, but now you are the only one fighting it. The toxic investment remains, proving that the person you are ghosting holds infinitely more space in your mind than you hold in theirs. The ultimate Stoic freedom is realizing they have no space in your mind at all. Not because you forcefully evicted them, but because you repurpose the real estate for something of actual value. If your decision to ignore is driven by the desire to see the other person suffer, guess who suffers first? You have introduced an active variable of hostility into your own internal system. Seneca wrote extensively on the self-destructive nature of anger, noting that harboring a grudge is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. When you actively ignore someone out of resentment, you are committing a similar self-immolation. You must dedicate constant mental bandwidth to maintaining the integrity of your contempt, ensuring that your facade of apathy does not slip, thereby transforming yourself into the jailer of your own peace. This brings us to the Rancor Test. How can you tell if your ignoring is true indifference or active absence? You test for rancor. Rancor is the sour, metallic taste left in your mouth when you think of the person or issue you are avoiding. Ask yourself these questions. The joy index. If you were to accidentally encounter this person tomorrow, would your immediate gut reaction be mild amusement or a sharp, anxious spike of hostility? The success test. If you learned they achieved a major success, would your reaction be genuine indifference or a silent, corrosive disappointment that their presumed suffering has been invalidated? The cognitive load. How many minutes a week do you spend mentally rehearsing what you would say if you chose to engage? If your silence is brittle, easily broken by a whiff of their success, or if the mere mention of their name generates an internal rush of anxiety, you are failing the Rancor test. You are not practicing Stoic detachment. You are practicing a highly stressful form of psychological denial. The energy expenditure necessary to suppress genuine feeling is always greater than the energy required to process and dismiss the original stimulus. Modern society encourages us to believe that suppressing difficult emotions is a sign of strength, the stiff upper lip of digital existence. We are taught to manage our profiles, not our internal states. This leads directly to chronic, low-grade anxiety, where the mind is perpetually waiting for the internal dam of suppressed hostility to burst. The Rancor test reveals that true psychological defense is not avoidance, but immediate, ruthless processing, categorizing the external event as irrelevant, dismissing the need for external validation, and moving on to purposeful action. The common counter-argument here is, but what if the conflict is important? What if I am ignoring injustice or a necessary confrontation? This is a crucial distinction. Ignoring is the strategic retreat from a necessary engagement. True Stoicism does not advocate for being a doormat. It advocates for confronting external reality with disciplined courage, deciding what is worth fighting for and what is not. If the matter is important, you address it efficiently, strategically, and without emotional heat. If the matter is unimportant, you do not ignore it reactively. You simply fail to notice it structurally. The moment you actively choose to ignore an unimportant matter, you imbue it with importance. This active absence transforms minor disturbances into major cognitive anchors, proving that your failure is one of psychological classification, not lack of effort. We are terrified of confrontation because we are terrified of revealing our own investment. We use active absence as a shield to hide the shame of caring too much about something that does not serve us. The paradox is that the more fiercely we cling to the active absence, the more profound our investment becomes, and the heavier the hidden tax we pay in mental fatigue. To pass the Rancor Test is to reach a state where you genuinely forget the existence of the minor aggressor, not through effort, but through genuine, unforced priority displacement. The liberation from the burden of reactive ignoring is achieved not by changing how you look at the object, but by radically changing the landscape upon which you stand. This is the transition from attitude to altitude. If you are standing on the sidewalk, a barking dog or a disgruntled neighbor is an immediate and unavoidable nuisance. If you ascend to the 40th floor of a skyscraper, the sound of the dog is structurally irrelevant. You are not actively ignoring the sound. You are simply too high for the sound waves to reach you with sufficient intensity to matter. This is the model for psychological freedom, the creation of structural irrelevance. The goal is to elevate your perspective, your personal mission, and your daily output to such an extent that the issues, people, and minor criticisms that used to demand your mental energy no longer register on your scale of importance. Marcus Aurelius encourages us to adopt the view from above, to look down upon the petty squabbles, the frantic commuting, and the short duration of human life. This perspective instantly minimizes the importance of immediate, transitory validation or offense. When your focus is fixed on goals that might outlive you, deep work, lasting contribution, the development of profound wisdom, the desire to check who is angry at you on social media dissolves because it offers no energetic return on your ultimate investment. Structural irrelevance is the strategic upgrade of the self. It requires shifting your entire validation mechanism away from external feedback and towards internal metrics of excellence and discipline. When you are deeply engaged in a pursuit that genuinely requires 100% of your cognitive capacity, mastering a skill, building a business, or writing a significant body of work, the space available for resentment, reaction, and tracking the ignored party evaporates. You are not choosing not to react. You are physiologically and strategically unable to react because your resources are allocated elsewhere. The strategic upgrade of the self must be so profound, so demanding, and so focused on creating genuine, lasting value that the need for short-term validation, the fuel of anxiety and digital addiction, is starved out of existence. When you are relentlessly pursuing an attainable state of excellence, the noise generated by minor detractors ceases to be irritating and becomes simply static, irrelevant background information processed and discarded by a system running too efficiently to pause. If you made it this far, you are not like the majority. They are the system's error report, confirmation that the operating parameters you have established require a level of dedicated maintenance that few are willing to sanction. This is the inflection point where the architecture of sustained output must be fully internalized, finalizing the separation between the producer and the consumer, the architect and the tenant. Pillar 2 concludes not with the completion of a project, but with the establishment of an indelible operating state, the state of perpetual calibration. The amateur seeks validation upon delivery. The master seeks the next fault in the design. The work is never truly submitted for external judgment. It is only paused long enough to allow the world to experience the byproduct of an infinitely self-correcting engine. The world's feedback is merely one data stream among many, almost entirely negligible when stacked against the relentless internal audit conducted by the pursuit of perfection. This internal audit constitutes the necessary condition for escape velocity, the point at which the internal thrust overrides the gravitational pull of cultural mediocrity. The mind must be hardened against its own inherent tendency toward entropy, complacency, and the cognitive ease provided by routine. True value creation is a fundamentally aggressive act against the status quo, and the architecture must reflect this aggression. If Pillar 1 established the bedrock of identity and Pillar 2 engineered the engine of production, then the final structural pillar, Pillar 3, must focus on the ultimate means of refinement, the process by which a high-output system ensures that its power is not merely exerted, but perfectly aimed. This is the principle of necessary trauma. The greatest threat to a highly optimized system is not external interference, trolling, market crashes, or competition, but the internal softness that develops when initial success breeds psychological comfort. Entropy loves a quiet mind. The moment the internal monologue shifts from "how can I make this better" to "this is good enough," the process of decay begins. To counteract this, the system must intentionally introduce stress that simulates real-world failure, but within a controlled, self-imposed environment. This is the concept of friendly fire. Friendly fire is the deliberate, non-negotiable imposition of the highest standard of critique upon oneself and one's work, sourced only from those elements, internal or external, that possess zero tolerance for comfortable mediocrity. It is the architectural decision to dismantle and rebuild perfectly functional components, simply because a theoretical 1% gain in efficiency has been identified. It is the process of setting the target so far beyond the plausible horizon that the current effort becomes laughably insufficient, forcing a fundamental and painful redesign of the effort mechanism. This is not neurotic self-flagellation. That is the domain of the uncalibrated amateur who uses self-loathing as a substitute for discipline. Friendly fire is calculated, precise, and surgical. It demands that you actively seek out the brutal, uncompromising assessment of the 2 or 3 minds in the world that operate at a higher fidelity than your own. You do not ask them for praise or generalized feedback. You present them with your most cherished, most polished work, and you demand that they find the essential, systemic flaws, the points where your foundational assumptions are weak, where your data is thin, where your methodology is compromised. This process is inherently painful because the critique targets the ego's attachment to the product. The common man hears critique as a personal attack. The calibrated system hears it as critical vulnerability data. The system must be trained to treat pain as data, a signal that refinement is occurring. You must welcome the metaphorical tearing down of your foundational assumptions, because every piece that collapses under rigorous scrutiny was never strong enough to bear the weight of true legacy. This intentional trauma prevents catastrophic failure in the external world by provoking micro-failures in the laboratory. The deepest well of friendly fire, however, is internal. It is the uncompromising ghost of your own ideal self, whispering, often shouting, that the current output is merely a shadow of its potential. This internal critic is immune to negotiation, incapable of compromise, and operates on an eternal timetable. It is the silent, demanding presence that forces you to add 40 more hours to an already finished project. It is the architect of unnecessary complexity, demanding the perfect sentence, the essential argument, the mathematical proof of the work's inherent right to exist, even when the market would reward the merely competent. If you are not regularly engaging in acts of self-inflicted systematic stress, you are operating at a suboptimal state. You are coasting, and coasting is the precursor to systemic rot. This requires a difficult reprioritization, often perceived externally as cruelty or detachment. To eliminate slack, you must embrace the principle of high-velocity filtration. Filtration of association. Your inner circle ceases to be defined by affinity or history and is redefined by efficacy and rigor. Association must now be viewed as an investment of cognitive energy. If a person or group consistently demands energy without providing substantial intellectual or systemic return, they represent a net drain. This detachment is often the most painful component of friendly fire, as it involves severing psychological ties that offer comfort but inhibit growth. Comfort is a debt incurred against future performance. Filtration of identity. The most dangerous slack is the attachment to a specific, historical version of the self. The system must remain liquid, capable of instantly jettisoning established routines, beliefs, and methods the moment superior data dictates a change. The commitment is not to being an expert, but to operating according to expertise. If tomorrow's information invalidates today's thesis, the thesis must be destroyed without hesitation. Friendly fire mandates the regular assassination of past intellectual successes to make room for necessary, uncomfortable evolution. This state of constant, rigorous pressure is the only mechanism that ensures true value creation is not accidental, but structurally guaranteed. When the pressure is internal, self-imposed, and relentlessly maintained, the external world loses its ability to surprise, distract, or dismantle. You have already tested the limits of your own architecture in a far more hostile environment, your own mind. When friendly fire becomes the normalized operating environment, the system achieves a level of precision that makes traditional competition obsolete. You stop competing on metrics of output quantity and begin competing solely on the metric of fidelity. This level of fidelity is attained through a specific learned skill, the ability to delay gratification until the point of absolute, non-negotiable readiness. The amateur launches when the product is 80% complete, driven by the anxiety of needing external validation or the fear of being scooped. The master delays, refining the final 20%, the differential where good transforms into undeniable. This final 20% often requires 80% of the total energy, but it is where the slack is annihilated and the system achieves supercritical mass. This rigor, this refusal to release a partially formed truth into the world, creates the phenomenon that defines the true master's interaction with reality, the silent impact. The journey through the pillars, constraint, calibration, and friendly fire, culminates in the ability to exert massive, lasting influence upon the world, while simultaneously operating beneath the threshold of public awareness, noise, and digital metrics. This is the silent impact. The silent impact is defined as the effect achieved when the work itself possesses such structural integrity, such fundamental utility, or such compelling truth that it shifts the foundation of its field without needing the fuel of attention. It is the change that is noticed not because it is loud, but because the world suddenly operates according to its new rules. Consider the difference between a loud event and a silent system change. A loud impact is a volcanic eruption, immense, visible, attention-grabbing, but ultimately localized and temporary, generating vast amounts of ash that eventually settle. A silent impact is continental drift, imperceptible day to day, lacking any dramatic fanfare, but responsible for reshaping the global landscape over time. It creates new continents, new thermal systems, and new oceans. It is a fundamental, non-reversible reorganization of mass. The systems that achieve silent impact are those which have successfully externalized the rigor established by friendly fire. The work itself becomes the critique. The product is its own justification. To achieve silent impact, one must intentionally decouple the system from the metrics of the attention economy. Likes, shares, virality, follower count, or media coverage. These metrics are the measurements of noise, not value. They measure the speed of superficial distribution, not the depth of structural transformation. The practitioner of silent impact understands that high frequency is the enemy of high amplitude. When you create something designed for silent impact, you are making an architectural decision to optimize for depth and permanence. This means the work often requires sustained intellectual effort from the audience. It is dense, referenced, non-obvious, and demands contemplation. It does not provide easy answers or quick emotional hits. It is, by design, antithetical to the algorithms of mass distribution, which reward immediate cognitive ease. The paradox of silent impact is that by refusing to optimize for attention, the system optimizes for gravity. The value generated becomes so dense that it naturally attracts the most serious actors and the most relevant resources necessary for scaling the architecture. The common masses, starved for quick entertainment, will ignore the work, mistaking its rigor for opacity. But the few who possess the acuity to process the depth become the system's indispensable vectors, amplifying the impact precisely where it matters. In the levers of systemic change, the signal-to-noise ratio of the work approaches infinity. There is no fat, no marketing filler, no performative validation loop. There is only the essential truth delivered with the highest fidelity. The ultimate metric of silent impact is not recognition, but indispensability. When a system achieves silent impact, its removal would constitute a structural collapse in its surrounding environment. The system's value is no longer a matter of opinion. It is a mathematical prerequisite for the continued functioning of other high-value systems. This state is achieved by solving problems that are so complex, foundational, and widely necessary that their resolution shifts the field's entire operating floor. This is why Pillar 1's unbreakable constraint is so vital. It forces the architect to remain focused on the few essential problems of their domain, refusing to dissipate energy on peripheral issues. The master focuses on structural engineering. Everyone else argues about the paint color. When the foundation shifts, the argument over aesthetics ceases to matter. The value is self-evident because the alternative, operating without the solution provided by the silent impact, is demonstrably less efficient, less truthful, or less stable. The unbreakable constraint guarantees focus, the perpetual calibration guarantees efficiency, friendly fire guarantees precision. The result is a system characterized by an unnerving, almost frightening equanimity. Since the internal benchmark for performance is exponentially higher than any external metric, praise and criticism lose their emotional charge. They are simply neutral data points. The individual operating at this level is shielded from anxiety because anxiety is rooted in the perceived threat of failure relative to an external social standard. When the standard is entirely internal and ruthlessly maintained, the judgment of the external world becomes irrelevant. This is the psychological state of zero-based self-esteem. The reward for this relentless, focused pursuit is a freedom unimaginable to the majority, the freedom to be absolutely unknown while having maximum impact, the freedom from the neurotic cycle of seeking approval, the freedom from having to manage an external persona or narrative. You are no longer an actor in the drama. You are the stage upon which all future dramas must be performed.